The day I found the letter from the Sunset Ridge Homeowners Association tucked into my mailbox. I was standing in my front yard admiring the privacy hedge I just finished planting along the property line. My name is Xavier, and I'd moved into this suburban neighborhood in Phoenix, Arizona just 6 months earlier. The house was perfect, a mid-century ranch with clean lines and good bones that sat on a corner lot in what the real estate agent had called a friendly community. She'd neglected to mention that friendly apparently meant obsessively concerned with everyone else's business. I opened the envelope right there on my driveway, the Arizona sun beating down on my neck. The letter was typed on official letterhead with the HOA logo, a ridiculous design featuring a sunset and what I think was supposed to be a ridge but looked more like a badly drawn speed bump. "Dear Mr. Xavier," it began, and I already didn't like the tone. "It has come to our attention that you have recently installed hedging along your eastern property line that exceeds the maximum allowable height, as outlined in Section 7.3.2 of the Sunset Ridge HOA Covenant Conditions and Restrictions. Your hedge currently measures approximately 6 feet in height, which is 18 inches above our maximum allowable fence, and hedge height of 4 feet 6 inches. You are hereby required to remove or reduce said hedging to the appropriate height within 14 days of receipt of this notice, or face fines of $50 per day until compliance is achieved. Sincerely, Barbara Whitmore, HOA President." I looked at my hedge. It was a beautiful row of Italian cypress trees that I'd spent 2 weekends and nearly $3,000 installing. They were exactly what I needed to block the view from the busy street that ran along the side of my property. Before the hedge, every car that drove by could see directly into my living room windows, and the headlights at night made it impossible to watch television without closing the blinds completely. I pulled out my phone and called my buddy Marcus, who'd lived in Phoenix his whole life and had warned me about HOAs when I was house shopping. "They're already on you?" he asked when I explained the situation. "That's got to be a record." "The trees are barely 6 feet tall," I said. "They're going to grow taller eventually, but right now they're just tall enough to give me some actual privacy." "Did you check the CCRs before you planted them?" "I looked through that packet when I bought the house," I admitted, "but it was like 200 pages of legal jargon." "I must have missed the hedge height thing." Marcus laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. "Welcome to HOA life, man. My advice, show up to their next meeting and make your case. Barbara Whitmore is the president, right? That's what the letter says." "Oh, you're in for it then." "She's a piece of work. Moved here from California about 5 years ago and has made it her life's mission to enforce every single rule in the book, plus a few she probably made up herself." After hanging up with Marcus, I went inside and dug out the massive CCR packet from the filing cabinet in my home office. It took me an hour of reading through dense paragraphs about architectural guidelines, landscaping requirements, and paint color approvals before I found Section 7.3.2. Sure enough, there it was. Maximum fence and hedge height of 4 feet 6 inches for any structure or landscaping visible from the street. But as I read further, I found something interesting in Section 7.3.5. Trees planted for shade or aesthetic purposes are exempt from height restrictions, provided they are maintained in a manner consistent with their natural growth pattern and do not create a safety hazard. I took photos of both sections and spent the next few days researching the difference between hedges and trees. Italian cypress, I discovered, were classified as trees, not shrubs. They were just trees that happened to grow in a way that made them perfect for privacy screening. The next HOA meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday evening at 7 o'clock in the community clubhouse. I marked it on my calendar and started preparing my argument. When Tuesday arrived, I dressed in business casual, printed out my documentation, and drove the half-mile to the clubhouse. The parking lot was nearly empty, with only 4 other cars present. I'd expected more people to attend, but apparently most residents had better things to do than sit through HOA meetings. Inside, the clubhouse was exactly what you'd expect: beige walls, industrial carpet, fluorescent lighting, and the faint smell of old coffee. A folding table had been set up at the front of the room with 5 chairs behind it. Only 3 were occupied. Barbara Whitmore sat in the center chair, and I recognized her immediately from the neighborhood Facebook group. She was probably in her mid-50s, with short blonde hair styled in that specific way that required weekly salon visits, and wearing a blazer despite the heat. To her left was an older man in a polo shirt who kept checking his watch, and to her right was a woman about Barbara's age who was scrolling through her phone. 4 other residents sat in the audience chairs, none of whom I recognized. "Welcome," Barbara said, not looking up from the papers in front of her. "Please sign in on the sheet by the door." I added my name and address to the list and took a seat in the second row. The meeting started with standard business: approval of last month's minutes, a financial report, discussion about pool maintenance, complaints about someone's garbage cans being left out past noon on collection day. It was mind-numbingly boring, and I could see why attendance was low. Finally, after 40 minutes, Barbara said, "Now we'll move to new business and open the floor to resident concerns. Does anyone have anything to bring before the board?" I raised my hand. "Yes, Mr. Xavier," she said, and her tone made it clear she'd been waiting for this moment. "I assume you're here about your non-compliant hedging." "I am," I said, standing up. "I received your letter, but I believe there's been a misunderstanding. I didn't plant hedges, I planted trees. Italian cypress trees, to be specific. According to Section 7.3.5 of the CCRs, trees are exempt from the height restrictions outlined in Section 7.3.2. I held up my printed documentation, but Barbara barely glanced at it. Italian cypress used as hedging are considered hedges, regardless of their biological classification, she said. The intent of your planting is clearly to create a privacy screen, which makes them subject to hedge regulations. That's not what the CCR says, I replied, keeping my voice level. It specifically exempts trees planted for aesthetic purposes. Privacy screening can be aesthetic. The CCR doesn't distinguish between different types of aesthetic purposes. The older man on Barbara's left leaned forward. "I'm Bill Patterson, board treasurer. Can I see your documentation?" I walked up and handed him my papers. He studied them for a moment, then showed them to Barbara. "He's got a point, Barb," Bill said. "The language in 7.3.5 is pretty clear." Barbara's expression hardened. "The spirit of the regulation is clear, even if the letter of it leaves some ambiguity. Mr. Xavier moved into this community knowing there would be aesthetic standards to maintain. 6-foot hedges on a corner lot create visual clutter and set a precedent for other homeowners to do the same." "They're not hedges," I repeated. "They're trees. And they're 6 feet tall now, but Italian cypress grow to be much taller, which is consistent with their natural growth pattern as outlined in the exemption clause." The woman on Barbara's right finally looked up from her phone. "How tall do they get?" 20 to 30 feet typically, I said. "Sometimes taller." "Absolutely not." Barbara's voice rose. "We cannot have 20-foot trees blocking sightlines on a corner lot. That's a traffic safety issue." "They're not at the corner," I explained. They're along the side property line well back from the intersection. They don't interfere with visibility at all. Bill was nodding along. I drove by your place before the meeting. The trees look nice and they're not causing any sightline problems. If anything, they dress up that corner. It was looking pretty bare before. Barbara shot him a look that could have melted steel. That's not the point. We have regulations for a reason. If we allow Mr. Xavier to keep his oversized hedges, then what's to stop every homeowner from planting whatever they want? We'll have juniper bushes growing over sidewalks and mesquite trees dropping pods everywhere, and the whole neighborhood will look like an overgrown mess. I think you're being a bit dramatic, Bill said quietly. The third board member, who hadn't spoken at all yet, cleared her throat. I'm Susan Martinez, board secretary. Mr. Xavier, did you submit your landscaping plans for architectural review before installing the trees? My stomach dropped. I hadn't even thought about that. No, I admitted. I wasn't aware I needed to for trees. The landscaping company I hired said they were compliant. Susan made a note on her pad. Section 4.2 requires Architectural Review Committee approval for any exterior modifications, including significant landscaping changes. So even if the trees themselves are compliant with height restrictions, the installation without approval is a violation. Barbara looked triumphant. There you have it. Remove the trees and resubmit your plans for proper review. If approved, you may replant them at the appropriate height. But they are the appropriate height, I said, frustration creeping into my voice. This is circular logic. You're saying they need approval, but you're also saying they won't be approved because you've decided to interpret trees as hedges despite what the CCR actually states. I'm saying you need to follow the process like everyone else, Barbara replied. Meeting adjourned. She gathered her papers and stood up, effectively ending the conversation. The other board members followed her lead, though Bill gave me an apologetic shrug as he left. I sat there for a moment, processing what had just happened. Then I gathered my papers and walked out to my car, already planning my next move. Over the next week, I did extensive research. I consulted with a lawyer who specialized in HOA disputes, a guy named Robert Chen who had an office in Scottsdale. His consultation fee was $200, but it was worth it for the information he provided. Here's the thing about HOA regulations, Robert explained, leaning back in his desk chair. They're enforceable to the extent that they're written clearly and applied consistently. From what you've shown me, there's genuine ambiguity in your CCRs about whether Italian cypress planted in a row constitute hedges or trees. That ambiguity should be interpreted in favor of the homeowner, not the HOA. So I don't have to remove them. You might have to fight about it, but you've got a strong case. The bigger issue is the architectural review violation. That one's cut and dried. You should have submitted plans first. What happens with that depends on the penalties outlined in your CCRs. Usually it's a fine, maybe retroactive approval required. But here's the thing. If they reject your architectural review application for trees that comply with the height exemption, you can argue they are acting in bad faith. HOAs have a duty to act reasonably. I left his office with a strategy. First, I'd submit the architectural review application for my existing trees, documenting everything carefully. Second, I'd attend every HOA meeting and keep pushing the interpretation issue. Third, if they rejected my application or continued to fine me, I'd consider legal action. But I'd also decided on a fourth, more creative approach. I submitted my architectural review application the next day, filling out the forms meticulously and including detailed specifications for the Italian cypress trees, photos of the installation, and citations to Section 7.3.5. I submitted it by certified mail so there'd be proof of delivery. Meanwhile, I started researching other types of trees that would grow even taller than Italian cypress. If Barbara wanted to play hardball over tree versus hedge classifications, I'd plant trees that were so unambiguously trees that she couldn't possibly argue otherwise. 2 weeks later, I received a letter denying my architectural review application. The reason given was inconsistent with neighborhood aesthetics and potential for excessive height. There was no mention of the Section 7.3.5 exemption or any explanation of how trees planted for aesthetic purposes could be deemed inconsistent with aesthetics. The letter also informed me that I was now accruing $50 daily fines for the non-compliant installation, and that I had 7 days to remove the trees before the HOA would take legal action to force removal at my expense. I was furious, but I was also prepared. I'd spent the past 2 weeks talking to neighbors, and I'd discovered that Barbara had a pattern of selective enforcement. The house 3 streets over had a front yard fountain that was definitely not on the approved architectural modifications list. The corner house on Xavier Drive had painted their shutters a custom purple color that wasn't on the approved paint palette. Neither had received violation notices. I documented everything with photos and checked the architectural review records, which were technically public to HOA members. Neither modification had been submitted for approval. I also discovered something interesting. Barbara's own backyard had a pergola that extended 2 feet beyond the maximum allowable coverage for accessory structures. It was visible from the street through her side gate, and there was no architectural review application on file for it. Armed with this information, I showed up to the next HOA meeting with a different strategy. This time, there were more people in attendance. Word had gotten around about my dispute with Barbara, and several neighbors had apparently decided the entertainment value was worth an evening out. When the meeting reached the open comment period, I raised my hand immediately. "Mr. Xavier," Barbara said with forced civility, "I assume you're here to inform us that you've complied with the removal order. Actually, I'm here to file complaints against multiple homeowners for architectural review violations," I said. "Including you, Barbara." The room went silent. The woman next to me actually gasped, "Excuse me." Barbara's face flushed red. I pulled out my documentation. The CCRs require that all exterior modifications receive architectural review approval, and that all homeowners be held to the same standards. I've documented multiple violations throughout the neighborhood that have not received notices or fines. I'm requesting that the board either enforce the rules consistently across all properties, or acknowledge that selective enforcement constitutes bad faith administration and rescind my violation notice. Bill Patterson was trying not to smile. "What violations are we talking about?" I listed them off, including photos on my phone. The unapproved fountain, the custom purple shutters, a shed that exceeded the size limits on Juniper Lane, a basketball hoop mounted to a garage that blocked part of the sidewalk, and finally, Barbara's oversized pergola. "That pergola was there when I bought the house," Barbara sputtered. "Then the previous owner installed it without approval, which means you're currently in violation," I said. According to Section 12.4, new owners assume responsibility for bringing any existing violations into compliance. I'll accept that you might not have known about it, but the same grace should extend to me regarding the architectural review process I admittedly missed. Susan Martinez was flipping through the CCRs. "He's right about Section 12.4. Barbara looked like she wanted to explode. This is completely different. You deliberately planted those hedges despite knowing there were height restrictions. Trees, I corrected. And I planted them believing they were compliant with the exemption clause. You're deliberately maintaining a pergola that exceeds size restrictions. This is ridiculous, Barbara snapped. Bill, Susan, surely you see what he's doing. He's trying to distract from his own violation by throwing accusations around. Bill leaned back in his chair. Actually, Barb, I think he's pointing out that we've been pretty lax about enforcement in general. And maybe we shouldn't suddenly come down hard on one specific homeowner when we've let a lot of other stuff slide. It looks like selective enforcement, and that can get us into legal trouble. The difference is that none of those other violations were on corner lots creating visual blight, Barbara insisted. My trees aren't blight, I said. They're landscaping. Nice landscaping that I paid $3,000 to install, and multiple neighbors have complimented them. This was true. My next-door neighbor, an older woman named Dorothy, had specifically told me how much better the street looked with the greenery. The family across the street had said the same thing. I'd like to make a motion, Bill said. I move that we table Mr. Xavier's violation, pending a full review of architectural standards and enforcement practices throughout the community. We should be applying rules consistently, and if we're going to crack down on violations, we need to do it across the board, not just single out one homeowner. I second that, Susan said, Barbara's jaw clenched. This is highly irregular. But appropriate, Bill replied. All in favor. Bill and Susan raised their hands. Barbara did not. Motion carries, Bill announced. Mr. Xavier, we'll suspend your fines while we conduct this review. We'll have an answer for you within 60 days. It wasn't a complete victory, but it bought me time. I thanked the board and left the meeting, aware of Barbara's eyes boring into my back the entire way out. Over the next 2 months, something interesting happened in the neighborhood. Other homeowners who'd been silently tolerating Barbara's heavy-handed presidency started speaking up. A petition circulated requesting that the board revise the CCRs to be more reasonable and in line with modern expectations. Several people showed up to meetings to voice support for common-sense enforcement, rather than rigid literal interpretations. Barbara fought back by sending out a flurry of violation notices to properties throughout the neighborhood. The purple shutters got a notice. The fountain got a notice. Even someone's garden gnome collection got flagged as excessive yard ornamentation not consistent with community standards. It backfired spectacularly. Instead of forcing compliance, it united the neighborhood against her. A recall petition started circulating to remove her from the board. Meanwhile, my Italian cypress trees kept growing, now reaching about 7 feet tall. I documented their growth with photos and measurements, noting that they were following their natural growth pattern exactly as the Section 7.3.5 exemption specified. The 60-day review period came and went with no communication from the board. I sent a certified letter requesting an update and got back a terse response from Barbara stating that the review was ongoing and that I should be patient. I was running out of patience. I contacted Robert Chen again, and he advised that I could file a lawsuit to force the HOA to make a decision, but that it would be expensive and time-consuming. My advice is to wait for the recall election, he said. I've seen the petition, and it looks like they've got the signatures. Once Barbara's off the board, you'll likely get a more reasonable administration. He was right about the recall. 3 weeks later, a special election was held. Barbara was removed as president by a vote of 147 to 23. Bill Patterson was elected as the new president, and 2 new board members were voted in to replace Barbara and Susan, who resigned in solidarity. I thought that would be the end of it, But Barbara wasn't done yet. The day after she was removed from the board, I came home from work to find my Italian cypress trees had been vandalized. Someone had taken hedge trimmers and hacked away at several of them, cutting them back unevenly and damaging the main trunks. 3 of the trees were probably ruined beyond recovery. I was livid. I immediately called the police and filed a report, then set up security cameras around my property. I had a strong suspicion who was responsible, but no proof. The police officer who took my report was sympathetic but realistic. Unless you've got video or witnesses, there's not much we can do. Could be anyone. You have any disputes with neighbors? Just the former HOA president, I said, and explained the situation. The officer made notes but didn't seem optimistic. Document the damage with photos, get repair estimates, and we'll add it to the report. If your cameras catch anything else, call us right away. I spent the next day getting quotes from landscapers. The damaged trees would cost about $1,500 to replace. I filed an insurance claim and also sent a letter to the HOA documenting the vandalism and noting that it had occurred immediately after the board leadership change. 2 nights later, my cameras caught someone. At 2 in the morning, a figure in dark clothing approached my property with what looked like pruning shears. The motion sensors triggered the camera recording, and I watched live on my phone as the person started toward my trees. I called 911 immediately, then turned on my exterior floodlights remotely through my phone app. The entire front and side yard lit up like a football stadium, and the figure froze, clearly startled. They looked around, then started to run. But not before the camera got a clear shot of their face. It was Barbara Whitmore. The Phoenix police arrived within minutes. I showed them the video footage, and they immediately went to Barbara's house, which was only 4 streets away. I didn't go with them, but I heard later from Dorothy next door what happened. Barbara had answered the door still wearing the dark sweatshirt and pants from the video. She denied everything at first, but when confronted with the video evidence, she'd broken down and admitted to the earlier vandalism as well. She claimed she was defending community standards, and that I had destroyed the neighborhood aesthetic. She was arrested for criminal trespassing and criminal damage, both misdemeanors, but because this was the second offense, the charges were taken seriously. Over the next few weeks, the legal process played out. Barbara hired a lawyer and tried to argue that she was under extreme stress from the recall election and hadn't been thinking clearly. The prosecutor wasn't sympathetic, especially after I provided evidence of the sustained harassment through the HOA violation notices and fines. Barbara eventually pleaded guilty to reduced charges and was sentenced to 6 months of probation, community service, and ordered to pay restitution for all the damages to my trees, including the cost of replacement and installation. The total came to just over $3,000. But the HOA story didn't end there. The new board, led by Bill Patterson, commissioned a full review of the CCRs and hired a lawyer to help rewrite them to be more reasonable and unambiguous. The process took months and involved multiple community meetings where homeowners could provide input. The new CCRs had clear, sensible regulations. Trees were explicitly defined as separate from hedges and fences, with height exemptions for ornamental and shade trees that didn't create safety hazards. The architectural review process was streamlined and included reasonable timelines for board responses. And most importantly, there were provisions for consistent enforcement and an appeals process for homeowners who felt they were being treated unfairly. My Italian cypress trees were officially approved retroactively. The new board sent me a letter apologizing for the previous administration's handling of the situation and thanking me for bringing the enforcement inconsistencies to their attention. With Barbara's required restitution payment, I not only replaced the damaged trees but added more landscaping throughout my yard. I planted taller Italian cypress to replace the damaged ones, and this time I planted them at 8 feet tall, the largest size the nursery had available. When they were delivered and installed, I made sure to take photos and send a cheerful email to the new HOA board, documenting my approved ornamental trees installed consistent with Section 7.3.5 exemptions. Bill replied with a simple, "Looks great, Lucas. Enjoy your privacy." The trees continued to grow. Within a year, they reached 12 feet. Within 2 years, they were approaching 15 feet. They created a beautiful green wall that completely screened my property from the street, providing exactly the privacy I'd wanted when I first moved in. More importantly, they became something of a legend in the neighborhood. New residents would ask about the trees that caused the HOA revolt, and longtime residents would share the story of how one homeowner's stand against unreasonable enforcement led to a complete restructuring of the community rules. Dorothy next door loved telling the story. "Lucas here took on Barbara Whitmore and won," she'd say to anyone who'd listen. "And the neighborhood is better for it." The irony wasn't lost on me. The HOA had demanded I remove my privacy hedges because they were too tall. So I'd fought to keep them, won the right to have trees instead of hedges, and ended up planting them even taller than before. The final height of mature Italian cypress in my climate would be around 25 feet, more than 4 times the height Barbara had originally objected to. But the real victory wasn't about the trees. It was about standing up to unreasonable authority and forcing a system to be fair and consistent. It was about community members coming together to demand better governance. It was about not backing down when you know you're right. About 6 months after Barbara's probation ended, I ran into her at the grocery store. She was in the produce section, and we made eye contact over the tomatoes. For a moment, I thought she might just turn and walk away, but instead she approached me. "Mr. Xavier," she said stiffly, "I owe you an apology." I was genuinely surprised. "Okay." I was out of line with how I handled your landscaping situation, and obviously the vandalism was completely inexcusable. I let my need for control override my common sense. She paused, looking uncomfortable. "I've been in therapy since the arrest, working on some things." "That's good," I said, meaning it. "I hope it helps." "Your trees do look nice," she admitted. "Better than I wanted to acknowledge at the time." They've actually inspired several other homeowners to improve their landscaping, and the neighborhood does look better overall. "Thanks," I said. "And for what it's worth, I think some of the standards you were trying to maintain weren't inherently wrong." It was more about the inflexibility and selective enforcement. She nodded. "My therapist says I have control issues stemming from feeling powerless in other areas of my life. The HOA presidency was the one place I felt like I had authority, and I abused it." She shifted her grocery basket from one arm to the other. "Anyway, I wanted to say I'm sorry. You didn't deserve the harassment." "I appreciate that," I said. "And I'm sorry it escalated to the point where you felt like vandalism was the answer. That must have been a dark place to be in." We talked for a few more minutes, awkwardly but civilly, and then went our separate ways. I never became friends with Barbara, but I did see her around the neighborhood occasionally after that, and we'd nod politely to each other. The new HOA board continued to function much more smoothly. Architectural review applications were processed efficiently. Enforcement was consistent but reasonable. The community pool got renovated, the common areas were better maintained, and the annual HOA meetings actually became productive rather than contentious. My Italian cypress trees kept growing taller, eventually becoming a neighborhood landmark. In the summer, they provided shade along the sidewalk. In the winter, they stayed green when most other landscaping turned brown. Birds nested in them, which I considered a bonus. 3 years after I'd first planted those trees, I was sitting on my front porch one evening when a young couple walked by, clearly looking at houses in the neighborhood. They stopped in front of my property, admiring the trees. "This is beautiful," the woman said to her partner. "This is exactly the kind of neighborhood I want to live in, where people care about their landscaping and can have nice privacy without everything looking like a prison." I smiled to myself. That row of Italian cypress trees that Barbara had insisted were ugly hedges in violation of community standards had become an asset that attracted new homeowners. The real estate agent showing them houses would probably use my property as an example of the neighborhood's character. The whole situation had taught me valuable lessons about homeowner associations. They're not inherently evil, despite what internet forums would have you believe. They serve a legitimate purpose in maintaining property values and community standards. But they're only as good as the people running them, and they need clear rules, consistent enforcement, and accountability to the homeowners they serve. When board members let power go to their heads, or when rules become more important than common sense, problems arise. But when homeowners stay informed, participate in governance, and stand up for reasonable interpretations of regulations, HOAs can actually function the way they're supposed to. I never had another major dispute with the Sunset Ridge HOA. I submitted architectural review applications for a deck I added to the back of the house, and for new exterior paint a year later. Both were approved quickly with helpful feedback from the board. I even volunteered to serve on the architectural review committee. Figuring my experience gave me a unique perspective on balancing standards with flexibility. The whole experience turned me from a passive homeowner who didn't think much about community governance into an active participant who understood the importance of good leadership and clear communication. I attended HOA meetings regularly, not because I expected conflict, but because I wanted to stay informed and contribute to decisions that affected the neighborhood. And every time I looked at my Italian cypress trees, now standing tall and full at over 20 feet high, I remembered the principle that mattered most. Sometimes you have to stand your ground for what's right, even when authority insists you're wrong. The rules matter, but interpretation and fairness matter just as much. And when you're in the right, the fight is worth it. My privacy hedge that wasn't a hedge had become exactly what I'd hoped for, giving me the peaceful enjoyment of my property while looking beautiful and contributing positively to the neighborhood aesthetic. Barbara had demanded I remove them because they were too tall. Instead, through standing firm on the letter of the regulations and fighting for consistent enforcement, I'd ended up with trees more than 3 times taller than she'd originally objected to. The final twist came 4 years after the initial dispute. The Sunset Ridge HOA won an award from the Phoenix Area Homeowner Association Council for Best Community Governance Improvement. Bill Patterson accepted the award at a ceremony and gave a speech about how the community had transformed from rigid rule enforcement to balanced, reasonable administration. In his speech, he specifically mentioned a dispute over some trees that became a catalyst for positive change. He didn't name me directly, but everyone in the neighborhood knew what he was talking about. Several people called and texted me congratulations, as if I'd done something heroic, rather than just stubbornly refusing to remove some landscaping I'd legally planted. but maybe that's the point. Sometimes the small acts of resistance against unreasonable authority are what lead to bigger positive changes. Sometimes standing up for yourself ends up helping everyone around you. Sometimes planting trees taller is about more than just the trees. My corner lot in Phoenix, with its beautiful row of Italian cypress trees providing privacy, shade, and character, stood as a permanent reminder that rules should serve people, not the other way around. And that when an HOA demands something unreasonable, sometimes the best response is not to back down, but to push back even harder. I'd moved to Sunset Ridge looking for a comfortable home in a nice neighborhood. What I got was a home, a community I'd helped improve, and a story I'd be telling for years. And trees that grew taller every year, reaching toward the Arizona sky, completely legal and completely satisfying. The HOA had demanded I remove my privacy hedges. Instead, I'd planted them taller, and in the process, planted the seeds for positive change throughout the entire community.